The Blackmar burial site. I am the spirit of Esben Blackmar, the first of the Blackmars to reside in Newark. My people sailed from England to Rhode Island. Future generations pushed west into Connecticut and then further west into Greene County, New York, which is about 30 miles southwest of Albany. I was born in 1805 in the Greene County village of Freehold. By the time I was a young man, I too looked west. The Erie Canal had been completed in 1825, and the next year I left Freehold with my brother Ransom for Lockville, which today you would know as East Newark. I was 21 years old. Lockville was an established settlement dating back to 1805. Newark was a relatively new community, a little less than a mile to the west. James P. Bottle, who I believe you've met already, was also born and raised in Freehold and was already a resident in Newark. Ransom and I decided we had better opportunities there. We took over operation of Newark's second general store, which had been built by Colonel Bartle and was being run by the Miller brothers. Soon we were purchasing produce and grain from area farmers for shipments down the Erie Canal to Albany and points beyond. Our contacts in Albany helped to make this a profitable enterprise. When the cost of shipment became a major expense, we created our own shipping fleet. Shops in Newark and Lockville built our canal boats with passenger cabins in the front. The Erie Canal had brought hundreds to the region, and our boats proved to be a popular mode of travel for groups of people wishing to visit friends and relatives back east. The cooking and crew accommodations were in the rear of the boat. The freight was held in the center of the boat with a capacity of about 600 bushels of grain that was purchased from the area farmers. They welcomed this opportunity to raise cash for their crops. These early settlers of Arcadia were families of little means, and they needed cash to pay their taxes and their land debts. Since the nearest bank was many hours away in Geneva, we also became bankers for the farmers. We made them loans for payments on their land and sold them dry goods and supplies on 1 year's time until they could plant and harvest their crops. Any remaining funds were left with us until they were needed. Eventually, more community members banked with us. This practice continued even after Fletcher Williams opened the Bank of Newark in 1841. I was able to pay good interest on the funds left in my care by investing in land and production in a country that was growing and expanding. I found investments in places as far away as Michigan, Illinois, and Iowa. There seemed to be no limit, but as I came to realize, nothing lasts forever. I strive for and achieve success, but my civic life and personal relationships were just as important to me. I came to Newark early in its existence and was glad to grow with the community. My wife, Arabella, and I had 4 children here. I was several times supervisor of Arcadia and twice represented the district in the state legislature. For a short time, I was a representative in the United States Congress. I helped to establish St. Mark's Episcopal Church. And outside of Arcadia, I donated land to what would become Hillsdale College in Michigan and built a fine house there for my oldest daughter, Jane. That house is now part of the Hillsdale campus. My cousin Horace Blackmar, who came to Newark in 1835, moved to Hillsdale in 1860 and eventually became its mayor. That was the nature of the Blackmars, always exploring. It's why the name of Blackmar has all but disappeared from Newark. Some stayed in the village they called home, but the children moved on. But getting back to Horace, he and I helped to expand Newark. In 1839, the village limits ended at Maple Court. We purchased land to the south and laid out lots and streets. Mason, Madison, Jefferson, Franklin, Williams, Grant. These were just some of the streets we developed. We loved our village and we were well regarded here. But then came the Panic of 1857. The bottom fell out of the national economy, and I was unable to fulfill my obligations to those who entrusted their savings to my care. The Bank of Newark survived the panic, and this added to my shame. Unable to face this fate, I took my own life. It was written that no man in Newark commanded the respect and confidence of the community to a greater degree than did Esben Blackmar. So when you see the sign for Blackmar Street, have a kind thought for the man who helped create Newark. Thank you.
Everybody here?
Everybody is here.
Is that one of those new Kodak cameras they invented in 1880? Well, my name is Ezra Jett, and while the name may be familiar to you because there's an Edgett Street in Newark, it was named after me, and the canning factory, which was where you people call Cannery Row, that was Edgett Burnham, and that was a company I started. If you don't mind, I've got a few notes here. You know, I'm 191 years old, so it's hard to remember my lines. However, I do remember very clearly my childhood in Camden, New York. And on the farm there, as I got older, my family was in the canning business of sorts, and we packed meat, vegetables, corn, and some fruit for the Army in the war between the states. And later, as a young man, I traveled to New York City and learned the canning business from a company called Kemp Day and Company. So after the war and back in Camden, we experimented more with fruit. However, there was not a lot of fruit available to can, and so, well, my brother and I ended up in the canning business in Fairport. My brother's name was Ananias Edgett. Well, I was about 37, and I was looking around for a place to start my own factory. Well, it'd be nice to be on the canal, and nice to be on the New York Central. Newark. There's where I ended up. We used the canal. We pumped water out of the canal for cooling, steam, and so forth. And then we were able to let our processing water go back into the canal, not sewage. And that's why we were where we were, and we were there for a long time. And we called the company the Wayne County Preserving Company. There's one of our labels. There's one of our cans. We specialized in, as they call, putting up of peaches, pears, quinces, plums, strawberries, raspberries, tomatoes, lima beans, and my favorite, peas. And we advertised put up perfectly and in their natural state. And one of the reasons we were successful because we had the foresight to manufacture our own machinery, which put us ahead of the competition. But one thorn in our side was the method of packing. We spent all winter making cans, and we really had no way of packing the fruit or the vegetables before the lid was put on, because this was all made ahead of time. So there'd be a hole in the top. The lids would be made with a hole in the top, and then the can would be soldered ahead of time. Imagine the labor it took to make these cans all winter long. We had half a dozen men, that's all they did. So then, once the fruit was pushed into there, or the vegetable, the cap would be soldered back on. by hand. Now, did any solder get in there? And then usually the customer would open it up like that. Not a perfect. We knew then it was not perfect, but even though glass was a better way, well, it didn't work at all. You certainly couldn't send glass to the troops in the war, and you couldn't. It just wasn't practical, and also you couldn't keep it from being tampered with, because once it was opened, you didn't know if it was opened or not. Certainly you would know if a can was. So, well, you know, I died in 1889, so I didn't live long enough to see the invention of the sanitary can, which was a big deal and saved the canners a lot of expense and time. And but I understand that my company, Edgett Burnham Company, it was run at first by my lawyer and then my widow, became the Edgett Burnham Company, and it once was described as the most illustrious canning company in New York State. So, well, I'm an angel in heaven now, and it is everything you ever heard about, except for one thing: those frozen vegetables they serve. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is that loud enough for everyone? Everyone can hear me? All right. My name is Helen Abigail Sherman Bloomer, but everybody called me Nellie. I was born in East Palmyra in 1839, one of 7 children of Durfee and Susan Sherman. And I do believe you met my mother and father way back there in the Sherman farm. When I was 10, we moved to Newark. My father later built the wonderful Sherman Opera House block on West Union Street. When I was 18, I married Samuel Bloomer of Newark, a grain, produce, and dry goods dealer who was in business here in Newark. But after 10 years, we moved to Yorkville, Ohio, where my husband had interest in coal mining business and also had a store. Then, after 15 years, we moved again to near Kingston, New York, where Samuel was superintendent of a cement works. However, his health began to fail, and we thought it best to come back home to Newark in 1884 after 25 years of living elsewhere. Our home was on the corner of South Main and William Street, where St. Mark's Church now stands. I cared for Samuel there until he died 5 years later in 1889. I was just 50 years old. Now I want to say a little bit about my 2 sons before I start telling more about me. We had 2 fine sons, and they're buried here. Robert Anson Sherman Bloomer, better known as R.A.S., and Charles Tauman Bloomer, better known as C.T. Let me tell you a little bit about them. My uncle, Stephen Sherman, had started a paperboard packaging company in 1896 in Schuylerville, New York, and C.T. worked there for him. R.A.S. at that point was studying engineering in Germany. Well, the company moved to Newark, and R.A.S. and Charles both worked there. After a few years, they became the owners. They changed the name to Bloomer Brothers. When the plant was completely destroyed by fire in 1900, everyone wondered if the company would rebuild or move to another place. But my boys had faith in this community, and the factory was rebuilt. In 1903, they incorporated, and I served as president for 9 years. There were not too many women back then serving as president, and I was honored that they elected me to do that. The company made paper egg cartons, ice cream pails, and other paperboard packages. I don't know if everyone knows this, but RAS and CT were founders of the Newark Country Club in 1923. Through the years, Bloomer Brothers Company changed hands and names several times, finally becoming Fold Pack. It sadly closed down in January 2002, ending over 100 years of paperboard container manufacturing in Newark. That was a sad loss for Newark. So I led a very comfortable and busy life here in Newark. I was very interested in genealogy. In the Women's Relief Corps, I helped the less fortunate. I loved the Shakespeare Club and the Eastern Star, and I was active in the Travelers Club. The Travelers Club was a women's group which studied places near and far, either places they had visited or would like to see. Well, as I said, I loved to travel, so in 1911, when I was 72, I set out on a long tour of the world. The next fall, in 1912, I found myself in Dresden, Germany. My son CT and his family had joined me there. You see, we planned to spend the winter together in sunny Italy, but it was not to be. I became ill and died unexpectedly of heart failure, and my family brought my body home from Germany by ocean liner. I was 73 at the time of my death. My obituary read, "Newark loses one of its most public-spirited and highly respected ladies, a woman of splendid intellectuality." Wasn't that very kind of them to write that? Here I rest, back home in Newark, the community which meant so much to my family, the Shermans and the Bloomers, throughout the years. Thank you all for coming.
I'm missing a few. I'll do it again if I need to. This burial vault was designed and built by Stephen N. Keener in 1874. Stephen Keener was born in 1841 and died in 1915. These vaults, or crypts, were used before the days of digging graves with backhoes. They used to dig them by hand, and in the winter, that was not an easy thing to do. Bodies would be kept inside during the winter months until spring. Stephen Keener served in the Civil War with the 160th New York Volunteers as a regimental carpenter. Keener was also a well-known architect, contractor, and builder. He built and designed the Marbletown Schoolhouse in 1876 and built most of the older buildings at the Newark State School. He also built the Emmanuel Methodist Church along with many homes. Emmanuel Methodist. Okay. He later engaged in the wholesale and retail lumber businesses, which was later known as, and some of us would remember, Caves Lumber. It was one of the largest milling businesses in this part of the state. End of story about the crypt.